Many leaders describe imposter syndrome as a deep feeling that creeps into their most important decisions. The moments in their leadership where clear thinking is necessary and wakes them up at 3 a.m. But this isn't going to be your typical conversation about imposter syndrome. Most podcasts, coaches, and leaders talk about imposter syndrome as fear. Fear of being found out that you're not as good as you think you are. Fear that maybe your success or your organization's success isn't really because of you. Or that maybe you've never had what it takes in the first place, and you're just lucky. This is not the conversation we're going to have today. In fact, I'm simply going to ask one question. What if some of those feelings and 3 a.m. thoughts are showing up not because of fear, but because there's something interesting pulling you somewhere you haven't been before? And then maybe one more question. If that's true, if you're being pulled towards something interesting, what do you do about it? Welcome to Crafted Clarity. I'm Steve Muscato, and that's what we're distilling today. When I think of imposter syndrome, the word interesting doesn't come to mind. But that word is actually, interesting. Recently, I watched an interview with a very successful business owner and restaurateur. He was talking about how he continues to reimagine success and how coming up with new things for his restaurant is critical to sustaining what he's built. By almost any measurement, he and his restaurant concept have been a wild success. And yet, he talked about continuing to push into new ideas, trying new things, and wondering what comes next. Not just to continue the success, but to continue to be relevant. The interviewer then brought up imposter syndrome in the way that most people do, asking about his fears, the feeling of being found out, and the anxiety that frequently comes with leadership and success. He then said something, really interesting. Essentially, his response was, if you don't feel imposter syndrome, you're not doing something interesting. I wrote that one down because there's a lot inside of what he just said. And the more I thought about his answer, the more I started thinking about the importance of the word interesting. And then I wrote down a slightly different question. What if what we might call interesting is actually a signal that something important is asking for our attention? And that is asking for some distillation. So let's start there. Something is getting our attention differently in this season. We might not know what it is exactly, but we just know that we're noticing something. And maybe interesting is simply the first word we have for it. But what if that something interesting is actually pointing towards something important? For some of us, what's being revealed might be related to what we feel is our purpose or our calling. For others, it might be a desire to do something more aligned with who we become, even if it looks completely different from our current business or position. And yet for others, it might not mean doing something completely different at all. It might simply be a different expression of who we are and how we want to use everything that we built. That's the tension. And if we don't try to answer the deeper questions, we can spend a lot of time sitting in that tension without ever understanding what it's asking of us. And this makes me think about a master distiller who, by almost any measure, had already done everything he needed to do. He'd built a spectacular career making whiskey. He earned an honorable reputation and received all the accolades. He even retired at the top of his game. And then at 72 years old, something interesting got his attention. His name was Lincoln Henderson. And if you're a whiskey drinker, there's a good chance you've tasted something he's had a hand in creating. Lincoln spent nearly 4 decades at Brown-Forman, one of the biggest names in American whiskey. He helped create brands like Woodford Reserve and Gentleman Jack. He was one of the inaugural members of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. Then he retired. But at 72, his son Wes came to him with an invitation to come out of retirement and build something together, using an idea that Lincoln had been thinking about for years. It's important to recognize that sometimes the voice that gets our attention can come through an invitation, an opportunity, or even someone else's voice. Or maybe there isn't even a voice at all. Maybe it's just an internal pull we can't quite explain. Maybe it's simply the questions this particular season of our life has started asking us. For Lincoln, there was Wes. And together, they began exploring an idea that would eventually become Angel's Envy. The idea was to take a mature whiskey, something that had already spent years aging in a charred oak barrel, and move it into a completely different kind of barrel. A port wine cask barrel. The idea is pretty simple. These are barrels that had previously held port wine. Even though the wine is gone, the wood has absorbed some of the characteristics of the wine it held before. So when you take an already mature whiskey and put it into that port cask, you're creating a completely different set of conditions where the wine barrel can begin interacting with the whiskey in a completely different way. The whiskey doesn't start over. Everything that happened in the first barrel is still there. The maturity, the character, the flavor, everything that made the whiskey what it already was. But now it's interacting with something new. And that's the really interesting part. Lincoln knew whiskey. He had decades of experience understanding what happens inside a barrel as the whiskey ages. But he couldn't completely know what this particular whiskey would become inside a wine cask. So he and Wes had to create the conditions to find out. Find the right barrels, give the whiskey time, taste it, and notice what's changing. Decide what needed more time, and eventually when it was ready. The first barrel had already produced a great whiskey. The second barrel was about exploring what else might be possible, creating something interesting. What eventually emerged became Angel's Envy, a whiskey known specifically for that port cask finish. So let's think about Lincoln Henderson for a moment. 72 years old, an extraordinary career behind him, a Hall of Fame whiskey maker, retired. He could have looked back at everything he built and simply said, "That was good." But instead, something interesting got his attention when his son asked a what-if question. That question led Lincoln and Wes to create the conditions to find out. And I think that's why the story stays with me. So what does it actually take to be a master distiller like Lincoln Henderson? And how does this apply to us as leaders? It's tempting to think that it's simply experience. Spend enough years making whiskey, learn the process, understand the equipment, know the recipes, and eventually you've mastered the craft. Yes, experience and becoming great at what we do matters. Lincoln had decades of it. But there's something else happening in this story that's worth talking about. A master distiller has to be really good at noticing. They have to be curious. They have to be willing to ask questions even about something they already understand extraordinarily well. And most importantly, they have to know how to create the conditions to find out what they don't know yet. Think about what Lincoln did. He didn't look at 40 years of experience and say, I already know what a great whiskey is supposed to be, and I can rest in that. He was still able to hear a question, something interesting. What if? He was willing to respond to an invitation from Wes. He was willing to take something he already understood and ask what might happen under a different set of conditions. And then he had to pay attention. That right there is the craft of distillation. Notice, question, create the conditions, pay attention. And I think there's something there for those of us who've been leading an organization or leading a long time, because experience can usually do one of two things. It can give us years of intelligence and even convince us that what we've already seen is everything worth seeing. Or it can give us enough confidence in our experience to trust what we know and help us answer different questions. And those questions are particularly important in this season of leadership for many of us. Because when something interesting starts to get our attention, it can be second nature as leaders to compare it against everything we already know. We start asking the usual questions. Does this fit my experience? Does this make sense given what I built? Is this something someone like me even does? And maybe that's where some of those feelings of tension we talked about at the beginning start to creep in. Imposter syndrome is real. I've faced it, as have many of the successful leaders I spend time with. But sometimes when we give something a name, we stop questioning it. We just accept the diagnosis. The distiller in us might stay with it a little longer to try to understand what else might be underneath it. What or who has our attention? Why is this interesting to us now? Maybe something underneath interesting is actually important. And like a distiller, we can create the conditions to find out. Lincoln understood what years in his career had already produced. He wasn't dismissing any of it. Everything that we built, our experience, relationships, successes, failures, judgment, even the things we learned the hard way, is all part of our current conditions. Those are the inputs that we're carrying into our next season. We're trying to understand what they might have prepared us for. And then maybe we ask one more question. What conditions would allow us to explore whatever's been getting our attention? For Lincoln, that meant starting a new season after retirement. For him and Wes, that meant rethinking what they knew and exploring something interesting. For you and I, it might be a conversation, trying something small, spending time around different people, putting ourselves in a room where we're not the person with the most experience, or simply creating enough space to pay attention. Lincoln and Wes were creating new conditions to discover what might be possible. And maybe that's one of the most important skills of the master distiller. We don't have to know what something means before we take it seriously. Sometimes we simply just need to notice something interesting already has our attention, and then create the conditions to find out why. And maybe this is one of those familiar questions that starts to sound a little different. Who am I to do this? I know that this is a question I've asked myself. And we can hear that question immediately label it as imposter syndrome question. And maybe it is, but let's stay with it a little bit longer. What are we actually questioning? Are we questioning whether we earn the success that we've already built? Whether we deserve to be where we are? Or are we questioning whether everything we built has prepared us to step towards something we haven't done before? Those are different questions. One asks, who am I to be here? The other asks, who am I to go there? And I think that distinction matters, because for many of us, we're not questioning what we've already built. We know what we built. We've lived the experience. We've earned the wisdom that comes with it. The uncertainty starts showing up when something interesting gets our attention and asks us to consider a different set of conditions. A place where our experience still matters, but can't guarantee what happens next. Maybe that's not something we need to immediately overcome. Maybe it's something we need to get curious about. And this kind of work, learning to stay with the questions and tensions of our leadership long enough to understand what's really there, is why I started calling the work of the distiller. I don't know what's been getting your attention lately. I don't know what invitation you've received, or what conversation you keep thinking about, or what idea has become more interesting than you expected it to be. And I certainly don't know what it means. For those of us who've been leading a long time and building experience and building a legacy, not knowing isn't always a place that's easy to sit. We're used to having all the answers. But maybe part of the work in this season isn't finding the answer faster. Maybe it's learning how to stay with the question long enough to understand what we're really asking. I've spent years sitting with leaders, helping them think through their organizations, their leadership, and the things that aren't quite as clear as they want them to be. And lately, I've been asking myself different questions about that work. What if part of what I'm supposed to be doing isn't giving the leaders better answers, but helping them become better distillers? Helping leaders and organizations get underneath the questions, tensions, and signals they're already experiencing to understand what actually matters. Because the more I do this work, the more I believe there's something important about learning the craft of the master distiller in our own leadership, especially in seasons where the questions are changing, when what has our attention is changing, and when something we might have quickly labeled as uncertainty, tension, or even imposter syndrome could be asking us to look a little deeper, maybe even towards something interesting. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you know you write down things that you notice that you otherwise might miss, things you want to remember and come back to. Here are my tasting notes from today. 1. What's getting my attention right now, and why is that interesting to me? Don't rush to decide what it means. Just notice what keeps showing up, what conversations stay with you, or what ideas you keep coming back to. 2. What question might be hiding underneath the label I've given to what I'm feeling? Maybe it is imposter syndrome, but maybe it's something completely different. The label might be accurate, but that doesn't necessarily mean the distillation is finished. And 3, what conditions could I create to explore what's getting my attention? Not to commit to it, not to change everything, just to get close enough to it to notice what happens next. And if questions like these help you notice and distill what's happening in your own leadership, you'll find these questions and more like them in the Still, our web app at craftedclarity.net. We started today with a conversation I heard where a successful leader said something I couldn't stop thinking about. If you don't feel imposter syndrome, you aren't doing something interesting. And after sitting with that for a while, I'm hearing it a little differently. Maybe sometimes what we're feeling isn't only about whether we belong, whether we're capable, or whether we've earned the success that we built. Maybe something interesting has started to get our attention. An invitation, a question, a possibility. Something this season is asking us to notice that we haven't noticed before. And like Lincoln Henderson, we don't always have to know exactly where it's going, but we can be curious enough to ask another question. We can create the conditions to explore it, and we can pay attention to what happens next. Because maybe interesting isn't something that we need to get over. Maybe it's something worth distilling. And if learning more about the work of the distiller is interesting to you, I've put more about it on the Crafted Clarity website. You can find it at craftedclarity.net/work of the distiller. Thanks for joining me today. And remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. If today's conversation resonated with you, don't let it end here. Visit craftedclarity.net to explore more conversations, reflections, and resources designed to help you distill the tension between what you've built and what you're built for. You can explore the Still, a curated experience that helps you find the right conversation for the season you're in, learn more about leadership experiences and facilitation through the work of the distiller, or connect with me directly for a one-on-one conversation. But whatever you're navigating, you don't have to distill it alone. And remember, clarity isn't found, it's crafted.